Session is about to begin. Mind the Gap, Bridging the Poor-Rich Divide. Please welcome the speakers with a huge round of applause.
Good afternoon, ladies and gentlemen. My name is Shahid Zahid. Some of you may be familiar with me. In case you came to the David Bowie session this morning. I'm here and I have the privilege to introduce to you Ms. Jacqueline Novogratz. I'll give a very brief introduction to Jacqueline, and she will then make a short presentation, and then we'll have a conversation with her. Jacqueline's family is of European Austrian heritage. Her family moved to the United States in the early part of the 20th century. She went to school at the University of Virginia, where she studied economics and international relations. She went to the Stanford Business School, and just as an aside, she was voted as the 25 best business graduates that Stanford University has ever produced. She joined Chase Manhattan Bank as an international financial specialist, but worked there for just 3 years and decided that she needed to do something a little more meaningful with her life. And she ended up working as a consultant for the World Bank and UNICEF, which took her to Africa. Specifically, she went to various places, but specifically Rwanda, where she helped set up the very first microfinance institution, Duterember. I don't know if I got the pronunciation right. I believe it was inspired by the work that Muhammad Yunus had done with the Grameen Bank, and that was quite an achievement in the context of Africa. She then helped set up the philanthropy workshop and the Next Generation Leadership Program at the Rockefeller Foundation. And finally, in 2001, she set up the Acumen Fund, which today I believe serves up to 125 million people in several countries across various continents through investments in what she has come to term patient capital. We'll talk about that later. She has also written a best-selling book, New York Times bestseller, called The Blue Sweater, which is a very enigmatic title for the book, and there's a story behind it, and I will insist that Jacqueline tell us that story at some point. I'm sure she's told that story many times, but it's a remarkable story, and I think it bears retelling over and over again. It basically tells us about how the entire world is interconnected, and it's a very personal story about a blue sweater. That's the title of her book. I have a lot of things to talk to her about over the course of this session, but before we do that, Jacqueline would like to make a presentation about some of the work she's been doing. So I'll hand it over to you, Jacqueline, and please, it's yours.
Thank you, Shahid. To be a bit unconventional, before I talk, I just want to congratulate the organizers of this extraordinary event. So much of what I think about and talk about is choosing love over fear, and the Lahore Literary Festival and all of you who came, despite all of the changes, really are standing for love, and I just think we should all take our hats off to them as many times as we can. It's also really extraordinary to be a person who works on poverty, to be invited to this festival and to look around and see so many incredible writers and artists, which are part of the beauty of Pakistan, and it's also a little intimidating, I must say. But I want to start by talking about home. I was on a flight from Islamabad to Lahore, and my little seatmate was this 10-year-old pixie of a child with little black bob of hair and velvet eyelashes, and she was dressed all in pink, a little bit like me, except little leggings with a tiny pink belt around her waist, and her name was Minahi. She was a perfect Pakistani girl, except that she spoke with the Italian accent of a grandmother. And she was telling me how much she loved Italy. She'd been living there for 3 years, and she loved the food, she said, and the colors and the people, and she loved the feel of the language in her mouth. And she was gesticulating the entire time that she spoke. And she had come to Lahore, she said, after 3 years to see her cousins. So many of them had lived there, and when I said that I was one of 7 and I had 51 cousins, she looked at me sagely as if I really understood the tribe. And I think a big part of me did. And right as we were coming into Lahore, she leaned over my lap, put her face across the window, her hands on my legs, and she said, "It is so beautiful, Lahore. I'm coming home." And we come from different places. We start with different parts. But when it comes to home, we may be different. And when it comes to meaning, I think we may all share a singular, similar story. This search for purpose, this search for meaning, this desire and yearning to be seen, to count for something. And this morning, when the plane landed here in Lahore, though I hail from New York City and had come in from Vancouver, I felt a similar sense of home. Because over the last 15 years, I've been coming back and forth to Pakistan and have realized through investing in entrepreneurs and fellows, through my extraordinary team led by the inimitable Naeem Zamindar, through the advisors that support us from Syed Babarelli to Zafar Khan and Zubair Somro, who've been with us forever, that I carry all of these individuals inside of me, and it's made Pakistan home. This is an extraordinary country of yours. I've been so touched by its beauty, the physical beauty of the mountains, the deserts of Thar, the fertile plains of the Punjab. I've been struck particularly by the generosity of its people, by the brilliance and the imagination of its poets and its philosophers, musicians. And I feel that, I hope that I can become more generous because of the generosity that I have felt here. And at the same time, when we think about what love is, what home is, it's a commitment not only to embrace what is good and beautiful, but to recognize where the flaws are, where we might need changes. And I believe that right now in the world, there's a singular issue that we all face, whether we're Pakistanis or Americans or in any country, and that is this growing, terrible divide between rich and poor. In Pakistan, it can be very stark, as all of you know. I think about some of the people that I have met, like Rajan, a farmer from Thar, who has 12 children and once a year during the dry season has to bring them all to work as a day laborer for 50 cents a day. Or the women of Chitral and Kailash, who have to burn very expensive wood inside their homes for fuel and for light, despite the fact that it's an enormous physical cost to them in terms of their health. When I think about where the world is today and the work that we do, our real challenge is to move from a place of separation, rich and poor, capitalism, socialism, tribes, religions, to one of integration, to one where we understand that we are part of each other, that I am because you are. Sometimes I have this image of this small world, and in Pakistan you hear this all the time. It's such a small world. And I want to say, well, it's actually a small class. Minahi, the girl on the plane, is part of the small world. But when I think about the women of Chitral and Thar, they're in the big world. And some part of me feels that they're in this dome of glass, and the poor are outside the glass. And the small world is on the inside, looking out, sometimes barely seeing the people on the outside, sometimes exploiting, sometimes fearing them as hungry mouths to feed, or people for whom they fear violence. Some people like Donald Trump would like to turn that glass into a brick wall and start to blame. But the real opportunity is to focus on integration. I think that this millennial generation, and I'm seeing so many of you out there, understand that we have one world, one planet, and that it is only when we really figure out how to extend our economy to include all of us that we will really have a hope of saving our planet and saving ourselves. As Shahid said 15 years ago, because I've been struggling with these issues my entire lives of what this means to be a single world, a single people, we started Acumen Fund with this idea that the big, ugly problems of the world were not going to be solved by the markets by themselves, nor by government by itself, but that there was a class of individuals called entrepreneurs that are seekers, they're learners, they will dare to try things and fail and then start again. And that there was a particular group of entrepreneurs, the social entrepreneurs, that were taking on some of the biggest problems of our day. So could we move away from this divided world that sees business on the one hand and charity on the others to give away as alms, and rather use that charity to invest in solutions to some of the biggest problems? Leave that money for 10 years, accompany it with a lot of management assistance, and measure the impact from that work. And 15 years later, we've actually seen that it does work. As Shahid said, we've seen over 125 million people get access to goods and services in India, in Pakistan, East and West Africa, Latin America, and soon the United States. Acumen works in all the basic services, in education, in energy, in healthcare, in agriculture, in sanitation. And to see the creativity of this new class of entrepreneurs is one of the great privileges of my life. What's different about these entrepreneurs and the really successful ones, though, is that they don't approach this world of uncertainty with fear. They approach it with a great sense of audacity, big dreams. And they also recognize that they've got to have the humility to start small. And I thought I would give you an example of how this works and how we connect the small world to the big worlds. Two graduates out of Stanford Business School had a dream to eradicate kerosene in the world. But all they had was a singular solar light at an affordable price. And the idea was that they would sell it to the poor. However, at the time, solar was really expensive. The poor had very little trust, and there was no financing mechanism. People thought they were crazy, and they thought we were crazy for financing them. And for many years, or at least 4 or 5 years, the naysayers were right. These guys failed over and over, but they kept getting up and trying again. And they, most importantly, listened to the customers. They understood that the customers cared more about cell phone charging than they did the light themselves. So they started designing the lights for people in that way. I really started to understand that our assumptions about what people need are not always what we think they need. When I was actually visiting NRSP, one of our investee companies in Bahawalpur, in 2010. So at this time, the company was starting to take off, but hadn't even come into Pakistan. It was a 52-degree day. Even the cows looked exhausted from the heat. And I sat there with a group of women weavers, sweat dripping down their faces, and I asked them what they thought about this light. It cost about 700 rupees, and I told them that it would enable them to stay up, their children could sleep, and I went on and on about the virtues of this light and that we were bringing it into Pakistan. And this big Punjabi woman leans forward, sweat dripping down her face, her eyes boring straight into mine, and she says, "We don't want a light. Bring us a fan." I said, "Excuse me? I don't have a fan. I have a light." She said, "We're hot. We don't want a light." I said, "But your children can stay up and they can study, they'll get better grades. You can work more." And she said, "We work enough. Bring us a fan. Forget the light." We didn't have a fan. We had a light. And for years, I played with that in my head. We didn't have a fan. But what happens in this world that's so exciting to me is that as D-Light started growing, as the price of solar went from $4 a watt to less than $1 a watt, as cell phone banking enabled people to pay on a daily basis for these lights, suddenly you could begin to feel a revolution coming. And last year, I went to visit a couple of hours outside of Kushab with Usman Ahmed, the CEO of Nizam Energy, another investment of Acumen's. And I saw the revolution in play. It seemed that after we turned off the main road and we were going down this big dirt road further into the rural areas, with every kilometer or so we were going back a century until we had gotten to this place where all the women were cloistered, all the men were out in the fields with very rudimentary instruments, and yet this family of 11 brothers managed to buy a 100-watt system that gave them 11 lights, a radio, cell phone charger, a USB port so that they could download their favorite music at a cell phone station in town, and sure enough, a fan. And when I asked them whether they valued the light or the fan, they said, the fan actually helps our kids learn better because they sleep through the night. It keeps the bugs away. This continued learning and this beginning of a revolution, if we really start to work together and think about new ways, not only to think about capitalism, but our relationship to one another. Now, of course, making this all happen is trust, which is the rarest currency that we have. I've seen that trust with AKRSP, one of our partners up in Chitral, that are dealing with the situation that those women have in their houses by building micro hydro plants that now the local communities are actually owning. I've seen the power of trust, which is not easy to build in societies where we know each other because we are like each other, and not always the people who are not. Back in Bahawalpur, where farmers have been beholden to the local artis, and now NRSP Bank has created an agricultural microfinance bank. And not only have you seen 250,000 farmers increase their own incomes, but because they have an institution where they feel like they're able to bank like the rich people, where they are seen, they've put 4 billion rupees of their own money from their mattresses into the banks as deposits. That's what happens when we start to build trust. Shahid and I were talking before that what I've learned over the last 15 years is that patient capital is nothing but a tool. It's a means to an end. Entrepreneurship is a framework. We need entrepreneurs. But too often in the small world, we're seeing some of our best and the brightest focus on smaller and smaller problems for a smaller and smaller group of people. You can find the best latte in town easily. But what we need to do is find those entrepreneurs who are working on the biggest, toughest issues that we have, and that means they have to navigate the gray. They cannot see the world in black and white, because these sectors of health and agriculture and energy and education are difficult sectors in which to work. So we need an ethos of moral leadership. And the good news in Pakistan, and the privilege of my work, is that there's a growing core of young leaders that are willing to do the hard stuff, to take on the big issues, to do what's right and not what's easy, and I learn from them all the time. I learn from leaders. Oh, but the problem is so often here, because there is so much uncertainty and fear, a number of young people tell me they want to pursue this kind of work, this life of purpose, but it's too exhausting just to get through the day. It's too exhausting to deal with the things that come their way. And so we wait, we hope, we complain. But hope is not a strategy without a plan. And so as I said, what inspires me are some of the young leaders with which we get to work. Acumen Fellow Abu Bakr Siddiqui works with the tremendous NGO Akuat, which is looking at making zakat more sustainable by making 0% loans and collecting clothing and then distributing it. And Abu Bakr tells this extraordinary story about why understanding identity, what we call the moral imagination, or putting yourself in another person's shoes, is so critical. He says that one day, cold winter morning, very foggy in Lahore, he was driving, And in the back of the car, he had all these newly cleaned winter coats, down coats filled with feathers, ready to distribute to the poor. And he noticed this laborer walking along the side of the road, shivering. And he thought, why wait for the office to distribute? I'll have the courage to pull over myself. And he pulled the car over. And he walked up to the man, and the man happened to be a water carrier, and he was incredibly cold and very silent. And Abu Bakr said, wait, sir, I have a coat for you. And he walked around to the trunk of his car, and he pulled out this newly cleaned down jacket wrapped in brown paper. And he went to hand it to the laborer, thinking that he was giving this great gift. And the laborer put his hands up in the air and he said, no, please, sir, don't strap that on my body. And Abu Bakr said, I had no understanding at that time that he could possibly think that I was putting a suicide jacket on him, that I was a recruiter, not that I was a man of benevolent means. And he didn't know what to do. He had no words, so he grabbed the man and he hugged him. And the laborer wept, and Abu Bakr wept with him. If we live with fragments of our identity, we're unable to see our own humanity and the humanity of others. The Lebanese writer, Ami Malouf, calls identity a false friend. And it is to us to really grapple with how we see others, whether we invite them in as friends or accuse them as potential threats. Javad Aslam is another young moral leader who inspires me all the time. He came to Pakistan to build low-income housing. In 2004, he's been working on it for 10 years, and while he practices the moral imagination, he also practices the toughness of showing up over and over and of holding values in tension, understanding that he has to work with generosity, but also with accountability. He showed up for 18 months to register this land and not pay a bribe. He showed up even after there was a shoot-up in the village and showed the villagers that he was a man to be trusted. But he wasn't an easy man. And indeed, when another Acumen fellow, Abbas Akhtar, came to work with Javad for his year in the fellowship, he thought he was coming to help the poor, he said, an engineer from Apple. And in his first week, Javad said, come, we're going to evict some of our residents today. And Abbas was taken aback by that. Why would we evict the poor and not help them? But Javad understood that if he was going to help, he needed to empower. And that meant that when these families were pushing him on whether he would be strong or not, he needed to meet them where they were. And so he hired two guys and brought the wire cutters. They went into the village. And sure enough, the first guy cut the lock on the door. They brought the bed to the flatbed truck. And before it was even on the truck, the neighbors came together and renegotiated the loans. And they got back to 100% repayment. It's that understanding that, yes, we must be generous. And yes, we must be accountable. These kinds of leaders face what Dorothy Day calls a long loneliness. And how do they get through that has a lot to do not only with their own fortitude, but a faith that comes from believing that they can help make the change, that the world can indeed get better. They also need each other. They need a posse. It's why we've invested now in 70 fellows across Pakistan from all parts of this country. And watching them, watching the ripples that come from the work that they're doing is one of the most hopeful things that I have been able to experience. In fact, Benji Williams started Amal Academy here in Lahore, and I have met at least 200 of the students with whom he has worked that are now going out to create other kinds of entities to help other young students. That's the way it happens. But in addition to a posse, in addition to a moral framework, in addition to building the skills and tools of navigating the gray. Young leaders also need role models. And in addition to Tasneem Siddiqui, Roshani Zafar of Lahore, shout out for her, was our first investment made in 2002. And over the last, now almost 14 years of investing in Roshani, of working with her, not only have I seen her dare to take risks, dare to dream big, dare to trust, dare to fail. And when she has fallen, I have seen her stand up and try again in a way that is more powerful than those that just do the easy thing. Roshani is the kind of moral leader that makes us all want to be better. She's also introduced me to some of the most interesting people I've met in Pakistan. People like Javad and Tahira, who live in a ramshackle house on the second floor, a ramshackle flat, rather, on the second floor of a little house not so far from here. And their business is to fry onions and put them in plastic bags with the brand MTH for the father, the wife, and the child. And then Javad, the husband, gets on a rusty old bicycle and he takes it around to 800 houses trying to sell them. And when I visited them and I saw the excitement in these two people and the skinny little guy Javad, I was thinking to myself what his life must be like, the daily humiliations, the invisibility that he must feel at times, and what does he feel at the end of the day lying there when the electricity doesn't work? Does he have the right to be angry? And yet, when you talk to this man, he is undaunted. He tells me that he dreams of creating not only a national brand for MTH fried onions, but an international brand. He is undaunted. He feels seen by Kashif. He wants to contribute to his country. This is a moment in history where it is our duty to dream big. We have to dream big. Because if I have learned anything in 30 years of working in poverty and 15 years of working with acumen, it is that the opposite of poverty is not wealth. The opposite of poverty is dignity. And the good news for all of us is that when we extend dignity, when we invest in dignity to those who are on the outside in the big world, when we give them the opportunity to be their best selves, that's the way we enable ourselves to be our best selves. For we will not have dignity as a human race until all of us have dignity. That's the conundrum, and that is the opportunity. Never in the history of the world has a global population had the opportunity to reimagine the kind of economy and society that we can build together. But it will take all of us. It will take this understanding that capital and talent, all of these are tools, but they must be based on a spiritual foundation of understanding that I exist because you exist. This is our world, our time is short, and our lives are so precious. So thank you.
Thank you, Jacqueline. That was really inspiring. Thank you very much. Are you going to tell us a story about the blue sweater, or should I? If you don't want to.
I will.
Yes, okay.
So, and this is in many ways, am I still mic'd? Yes. Yeah? So when I was a young girl, as I said, I'm one of 7, and my uncle gave me a blue sweater, and it had zebras in the forefront and Mount Kilimanjaro placed strategically across the chest. And I wore it all the time, including into my freshman year of high school when my adolescent curves started changing the contours of the physical terrain on this sweater. And I believe that there is a humiliating moment in every adolescent child's life. And for me, it was when my high school nemesis yelled out in front of all the boys that they no longer had to go to the physical mountains to go skiing. They could ski on the mountains on my sweater. And I was so humiliated that I threw the sweater into the Goodwill. And I thought I would never have to see it again. Fast forward more than 10 years. I was in Kigali, Rwanda, starting the first microfinance bank in the country when I was jogging through the streets and I see this little 10-year-old boy wearing my sweater. So I barely knew what to do. It was all instinct. I ran up to the child. I grabbed him by the neck. I turned the collar, and sure enough, there was my name written on the back of that sweater. And I have held that story as a metaphor for how interconnected we are as a world, and that our action and our inaction can impact people we might never know all around the planet.
Thank you. When I read the book, and it's a remarkable book, I suggest if you can get hold of it, it's available out there. Please get a hold of a copy. It's a truly inspiring story. It's a memoir. It's a story of Jacqueline from her childhood all the way through to where she is now. And she writes about this interconnectedness, which I think is a theme that runs through all the work that she's been doing. This story of the blue sweater just encapsulates that interconnectedness from Virginia in the US to Kigali in Rwanda 10, 12 years later, that same sweater, and she discovered it. It's amazing. And in that way, we're all interconnected. That's what her book really talks about. She's had a remarkable life and story to tell. Rwanda, Tanzania, starting in Africa with all the enormous problems, setting up that microfinance institution. And then you move to Asia and Latin America and various other places. You found a commonality in all of these places and the differences. But there's one thing you say which made me think a lot about everything that's happening in the world around us. You write somewhere in that book, with what you had seen in Rwanda and various other places, the horrors that you had seen, that there is a monster in all of us, but there is also an angel. And the task is to try and suppress the monster and unleash the angel. Can you talk a little about that? How this whole thing inspired you to, and what you do, how do you try to bring out this angel in all of us and suppress the monster?
Well, it has been an obsession of mine that why do we as human beings insist on a simplification of always looking for good guys and bad guys rather than looking inside ourselves? And if you go back to all of the spiritual traditions, there is this understanding of ourselves as flawed. And I actually think we're at this moment in history where we have the chance to define success not as the ones who make the most money, because I think that actually brings out our better monsters, but the ones who actually unleash the most human capability. And I wonder what the world would look like that if we actually not only identified those individuals that were releasing and unleashing human capability, and we linked them and inspired them and celebrated them as our role models. Would our children then scamper after each other to see who could do the most good, who could create the most service? And what kind of world would that be? Rather than a world where we're looking at each other all the time, wanting more and more and more, which at the end of the day doesn't necessarily leave us feeling richer. Yes. And so I think that's the ethos that needs to shift. And it sounds so simple, and yet it is it's almost like a prisoner's dilemma, because when the world is so uncertain and people are throwing blame, it takes true moral leadership to make that shift.
You also talk about the concept of power, and you write about how just the very fact of people holding on to power unleashes a monster in all of us. That there are no black and whites, everyone is gray, and there are different shades of gray. And that power is something where somebody, when they try to hold on to it, basically brings out a lot of bad in people. And this, being enamored of power and trying to hold on to it is something that happens. Now you deal with, in societies where I think this plays out in various ways. And there is the whole issue of governance that's associated with it. And power and governance, or bad governance and power go hand in hand. How do you deal with it when you're dealing with these different societies across the globe? I think the issues of governance are probably the same everywhere you go. Yeah.
They are the same. I think one of the most hopeful things that's happening right now in the world with the interconnections, the technologies, our seeing each other, is that we're finding solutions that can stay under the radar long enough until they actually get to a place of scale. And then to actually really get to scale, they need government. And so there are ways to work hand in hand for the good of the world. What I'm most excited about right now is actually in energy, based on everything that we're seeing, that despite the billions of dollars that we keep putting into the electric grids, and now it's so documented, not only in Pakistan but across Africa, 80% of the 1.2 billion people on the continent of Africa still live off the grid. The grid is not going to reach the rural poor for the next 20 years, if ever. And so rather than continuing to negotiate that and invest in that, we have a chance to actually prove that off-grid solar can be cheaper, faster, more effective than extending the electric grid. And in so doing, give local families, communities, access and control over their own lives. That is so exciting, and it's potentially threatening to a status quo. And so learning to negotiate power in a way that everyone can see that this is a real win for the environment, for the population, for government officials, I think is something that we have to do, because I think we make a mistake by saying all government is bad. There are individuals within that take advantage of broken systems. But I have met some of the most honest, hardworking government officials, as I have met some of the most corrupt and not hardworking NGO officials, that can we break those stereotypes and find the right partners, recognizing that we need government, we need the private sector, and we need civil society to create those models to show the world what's possible.
Which brings up the big question of what exactly is the role of the public sector? What exactly is the role of the private sector, if you like, or the non-government sector, or the non-public sector? And how do you reconcile these two? Because clearly there are roles that both can play, and yet they're also trying to sort of step on each other's toes all the time. So how do you reconcile that? Where does the public sector stop, and where does the non-public sector take over?
Well, the public sector, first and foremost, is there to create rules of the road so that the private sector can flourish. And that's a big thing in and of itself, and we're not seeing enough of that done in the right way. And then underneath, the public sector is there to provide a public safety net for the least among us. After that, it's to be negotiated. whether it is providing full employment, full education, healthcare, etc. But where I've seen some of the best examples in Acumen's work of where the public sector has really played its role was, ironically, in ambulances in India, where until 1298, the ambulance company in which we invested in was not playing its role effectively. This was a multi-billion-dollar broken, corrupt, and bloated industry. We invested in a company that had 9 ambulances, some of which were given by charity. And at the beginning, it was fully under the radar. But after a significant terror attack, government saw that the only responders was 1298. And that was the moment that they moved from not really paying attention to it to saying, let's partner, let's take it to the next level. And then we went with them to find those pioneering government officials that were trying to change in different states across India. And now that company, this year will have 3,000 ambulances, 8,000 employees, and last year took 4 million people to hospital. It wouldn't have done so without government, but it had to build a model that government could see so that it could provide services to the poor. And I think that's the promise, but it's a very nuanced approach.
You know, you mentioned the private sector and, you mentioned the private sector, and you also talked about agents of social change and entrepreneurs as agents of social change. But, you know, we also have this whole problem of unfettered capitalism, where people are doing this for the highest returns, quick money, and so on. But what you're talking about is something that you have termed patient capital, entrepreneurs of social change. It's a very special kind of private sector that we're talking about, where they're not looking towards returns in the short run or the short term. They're looking for investments that reap benefits over the long term, that invest in people who are then given the means, social goods and services that allow them to flourish over the long run. How do you deal with this? How did you come up with this whole idea that this might work, that this is something that, you know, it goes against sort of intuitive thinking?
Well, it wasn't my idea at all. I started to just notice that there were these trends that were happening. And when I look back over the last 30 years, I would say really until the last 5-10 years, social entrepreneurship was more marginal. Some smart people really focusing on trying to do this work in a different way. Today, and I keep looking over here at the millennials, we have a generation of young people that recognize that our resources are finite, our world is fragile, global warming is real, the poor are most impacted by it, inequality is bad for all of us. And they are starting to demand not only from the social entrepreneurs and the NGOs, but from the major corporations, more sustainability, better treatment of workers, better treatment of the earth. So we're now partnering with companies like Unilever and General Electric, because they understand that if they don't think about their environmental footprint and behave more like social enterprises, they're going to lose their employees, and ultimately they're going to lose their profitability. So I think that we're seeing a great convergence of all 3 sectors that realize more and more that they need each other. And in a way, I hope that our work can help identify some of the pathways where those sectors can work more effectively together.
So essentially, you're basically trying to engender
the whole system.
Corporate social responsibility and make it a part of everybody's thinking.
And even more than corporate responsibility, to recognize that our systems aren't working for all of us.
Right.
They're broken. And yet we now have the transparency to make them work better.
Right. You also talk about the role of philanthropy versus aid versus the kind of assistance you provide, which is providing capital but also mixing it up with management experience and training people and so on, so that they become, in a sense, they become rulers of their own destiny. How does this whole thing manifest itself?
So,
How do you convert the philanthropy into this positive thing?
So I have seen, and I'm sure so many of you have seen this as well, too often with good intentions, we give charity or philanthropy to schools or organizations, and then we find ourselves woefully disappointed when the results are more dependency, which is the opposite of dignity. Organizations that never grow, organizations that we might build a well, but then there's nobody to take care of that well, and then the well dries up and it moves and it shuts down. And so what Acumen does is invest in those entities that are looking for ways to make these projects sustainable so that they can cover their costs, so that they're not always depending on the benevolence of donors, but are actually enabling communities to solve their own problems. I think about some of the school systems in Pakistan that Acumen has invested in that are not only allowing those school systems to grow, but parents have voice. And we're seeing the quality of education actually increase. And we're learning so much because we're in real conversation with these companies in ways that, as you know, we did this work, that was not the case 20 years ago.
One additional thought. I mean, we're living in a world where, on the one hand, we see all this good work happening and all these forces being unleashed. At the same time, we're building more and more walls around ourselves. We're building barriers. People are talking about stopping refugees or movement of peoples and so on. So we're living in a very difficult world. And things might go towards the good, they might go towards the bad. Any views on how you see the world moving forward? I mean, we are all optimists, otherwise we wouldn't be here. We wouldn't be at the LLF if we weren't optimists. But we're facing a world of uncertainty, and sometimes it looks like there could be a very bleak future ahead of us, given the leadership that is emerging around the world. How do you see that, and how do you intend to deal with that?
So I agree with you, Shahid, that I see the world as almost two mountains of peril and possibility. And we're careening through the canyons. And the voices of peril are the loud voices. And right now we've got so much uncertainty with the price of oil, with China's economy, with terrorism, with the refugee crisis and what's happening in the Middle East. And fear makes us pull in. And I look at the Donald Trumps of the world, I look at the political leaders that have no better idea other than blame, build a wall, keep them out. And that is not the world any of us want to live in, nor is it a world that is good for us. And so for me, the other side, which gives me hope, is to move faster and faster with a greater sense of urgency, all of us, to start to build more inclusive systems, to find those leaders that are trying to make the change, to hold them up as examples, because I do believe as human beings we yearn for goodness. We can see that.
And the commonality.
And the commonality. I was just speaking to the Prime Minister of Bhutan, who has clearly a very small country. But they are out there with a model that already is carbon neutral. And his goal is in the next 20 years to have, to be able to sequester 50 million tons of carbon per year. by making very specific choices. And his economic models are so interesting, and his social models. Most of us don't have the luxury of having a benevolent king in a small, homogeneous population. But to know it's possible, to me, is the future. Over the last 2 months, I've been in Ghana, Nigeria, Saudi Arabia, Dubai, now Pakistan, places much of the world sees as more turbulent. And yet, inside the country, again, because of the work I get to do, talking to the young leaders in every one of these countries who want hope and possibility, and in a way to do what Martin Luther King talks about when he says you have to push the wheels of inevitability. Keep that moral arc of justice moving forward, recognizing that if we just succumb to power without love, we end up in a world of recklessness. On the other hand, if we are just spouting love without recognizing we have to know how to navigate power, we end up with sheer sentimentality. And that's why I'm so focused, Shahid, not only on building these companies as models, but as fast as we can finding these fellowships, which are as important as leadership, to build a war where we can show that we matter. And I think that that is the predominant desire around the world. We've just got to make those voices louder than the ones that we are hearing yammer, that only make us small.
Thank you. I'd like to open the floor to some questions. We have, I think, no more than about 8 or 10 minutes. So, yes, there's a hand over there. So we'll get a mic across to you. And if you can make your questions brief, please, and to the point, and make it a question.
Am I reaching you? Hello? Hello? Okay. My question is that my question is that we have talked about that a lot of self-help. A lot of self-help. You know, we are helping the poor to understand the system and to come out of the poor cycle. But the kind of the studies that we are seeing in terms of Thomas Piketty, the Capital, or the Darren Asimoglu about the Why Nations Fail, they say that there is a systematic system or the political system that ensures that people get rich, certain people get rich, and certain people are kept poor. So this is the thought that I am getting from the international scene, that there are certain political systems that are keeping poor rich, that are keeping, ensuring that certain regions get, So there is an entrenched bias. So I'm talking about that when you are in Pakistan or in a country like Nigeria, that have that system. We recently had that Rozgar system where the Prime Minister was paying entrepreneurship and everything. So what sort of view you have about political systems that perpetrate such economic policies?
First of all, to your point, I actually think that when I was thinking of the little girl on the plane, Minahi, and the small world and the big world, the elites are becoming more like each other across lines of nations than they are the poor in their own countries. And that is Pakistan, that is Nigeria, that is the United States of America. And this is a real issue for all of us. I think that the hope that we face as a world has to be to build more inclusive systems, or we're going to get where we're going. And that's not a world that we want to live in. The good news is that people are starting to make change. While Nigeria has President Buhari now, who is more of an authoritarian than quote-unquote a Democrat, he is fighting corruption left and right and giving a renewed sense of hope to young entrepreneurs in a way that I haven't seen in the last 10 years. In Tanzania, where we thought the last elections were going to be bloody and ugly, you're seeing a very similar story starting to take place. I think that we are smarter than we think we are, and we're better than we think we are as human beings. The question is, where do we give each other and ourselves the moral courage to speak truth out loud in a way that people can hear, and to band together for the right kinds of policies for this world that we need to build together? It's why I'm so hopeful for what the Acumen Fellows are doing across Pakistan. There are 70 now. I'd like to see that grow to 700, because this is where you start to get the ripples.
Any? There's a gentleman over here. Can you please, can you help open the mic, please?
Yeah, I think it's okay. More than 36 years ago, an initiative was taken which was known as North-South Dialogue. And the objective was to alleviate poverty in the countries in the South. Do you think that initiative, that dialogue, had helped this cause?
I think that the world has changed dramatically since then. We no longer have a world in which there are rich countries and there are poor countries, and it goes to your point over here. We now have a world in which every country has elements of the rich world and the poor world inside. And so we need a whole new paradigm and understanding of what our world is, so that we don't stay in this facile, well, that's a rich country, that's a poor country. But again, we're really looking at global structures and a global conversation about a world in which every human being matters. And that is a very different conversation than North-South, which was so driven politically. And I'm not sure a lot of listening was done, quite frankly. But regardless, I think the whole structure of the world has changed since then.
Yeah, and you know, the whole North-South dialogue was based on this idea of the North providing aid and assistance to the South. It was sort of almost like a one-way street. And I think, as you quite rightly mentioned, the world has changed tremendously. When you talk about philanthropy, you're talking about a lot of money that's being raised within countries to be reinvested within that country, from the rich to the poor within a country, and so on. So we're really talking about a very different world.
Different.
Yes.
Two things that really excite me about our work, without meaning to blow our own horn in any way, but to Shahid's point, we now raise significantly more than 50% of the money for Acumen's operations outside the United States. In Pakistan is where we've seen great generosity from individuals that are supporting the team in Pakistan for Pakistan. That's a really important story. We've just raised significant funds in Ghana for Ghana. The second piece that's so exciting to me is when we launch Acumen America, the idea is not only to reinforce this narrative, because I think storytelling and narrative is so important, which is why it's so fun to be here at this literary festival. But the dream is that we find innovation wherever it exists in the world, and we share it with the rest of the world. And the United States and Europe have so much to learn from Pakistan and India and East and West Africa, where you're seeing incredible innovation, and also vice versa. So it's time that we start reshaping a dialogue that brings out the best in us, that goes back to Shahid's first questions about how do we bring forth our better angels. In part, it's getting rid of the arrogances and the masks that keep us distant, to do what's best for all of us.
And telling people what is good for them when they know better what is good for them. You just said that. You told us that story about the
lady
fan,
with the fan.
The fan, yes. They want a fan. You want to give them a light. Where do we end up? I think we've run out of time. Thank you very much, Jacqueline Novogratz. I think a hand of applause for our wonderful guest. And I would like to encourage all of you to please read the book, The Blue Sweater. It's really a remarkable and wonderfully moving story, and it's a very personal memoir. And I think we all will learn a lot from that. Thank you again, Jacqueline. Thank you very much.
Hello. Please exit from the right side of the hall.
Thank you. Thank you. That was wonderful.